Thank you, Annika, and hello, everyone. Welcome to our session. I hope you've been enjoying the summit and all has been going well. I hear there's been some really great discussions, so I'm excited to hear how folks are taking all of this in. My name is Jamie Love. I am the Director of Programs for the People's Climate Innovation Center. I use she, her pronouns, and I am based in Cincinnati, Ohio, on Shawnee and Hopewell lands. And so I want to invite my colleague, Esme, to introduce herself. She's running the tech for us today. And in a few moments, our other colleague, Corinne, will be joining. And she's co-presenting with me, but I will turn it over to Esme.
Hi, all. My name is Esme. I use she, her, aya pronouns. I'm the Collaborative Partnerships Program Coordinator at PCIC. I'm based in Washington, D.C. on Piscataway land, and really excited to be here with you all today.
Thanks. And so I know there's a lot of folks in the room. We can't do intros with everyone, but we certainly want to welcome you and invite folks to drop your name and org and location in the chat and to share the native lands that you're on. If you're unsure of what those are, there's a link here that Esme just dropped in where you can put in your zip code and find out your native territory. So we love to see the variety and where folks are coming from. All right, I will go to the next slide. And just to share a little bit, I think you all may have heard this in some other sessions, but to know that we're here for the new R2E2 initiative, which is residential retrofits for energy equity. It's a nationwide initiative that will really be designed to provide training to state, local, and tribal governments, as well as community-based organizations and other partners that are working with energy upgrades for affordable housing, utilities, reducing GHGs, improving health, and creating good paying local jobs and helping to advance racial equity, which is a true focus here. And R2E2 is a partnership, sorry, go back one. It's a partnership of ACEEE, and our other core partners are Elevate, Emerald Cities, Collaborative, and HR&A Advisors. And then People's Climate Innovation Center serves as an advisor to the project on centering racial equity and the outcomes related to the work and community-driven processes. So, all right, next slide. I love seeing where everyone is from in the chat. This is great. Lots of folks saying hi to Molly, who's here in Cincinnati with me. All right, so our session objectives today are that everyone will understand the community-driven climate resilience planning tool and principles and frameworks. You may hear us refer to this as the CDCRP. We'll say the name again throughout the presentation, but that is a framework developed by PCIC and other partners. So hopefully you'll have an understanding of the principles and framework in this tool. You'll understand the spectrum of community engagement to ownership and be able to identify the best ways to engage with community members. And then participants can identify ways to build stronger connections between various agencies, including local governments, community organizations, and residents. That is the ultimate goal. Next slide. So this is really about our focus on communities, and we believe that community-driven planning is critical. Communities have the right to define their own priorities and needs, and not be defined by their local governments or other organizations that aren't necessarily representing their best interests or don't have an understanding of their needs. And it's really the approach and the practice that we use at Climate Innovation throughout all of our work. So that is the through line of community-driven processes. And our focus is really to break down those traditional top-down approaches where government is working in silos and really not considering the leadership and honoring the needs of community, but really flipping that so that community needs are centered and residents and leaders are part of the design and leading process along with their government partners. So it is not something that is top down, but is really a bottom up approach that is being community driven. And I see Corinne has joined us, so I'll let you introduce yourself really quickly, Corinne.
Yes. Hello, everyone. Thanks, Jamie. And y'all, like there's over 400 of us on this call. Maybe we need to say happy birthday to Jamie in the chat. Give Jamie some birthday love. It is her birthday, Capricorn season. Hello. I hope you all have been enjoying the summit. And it's glad to be a part of it and share with you all today. I am Corinne Van Hook Turner. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the director of People's Climate Innovation Center, also known as Climate Innovation for short. And I am zooming in from Ohlone territory. And yeah, I think I'll pass it on back over to you, Jamie.
All right. Thank you. Thanks for all the birthday love, everybody. I appreciate it. It's technically on the 25th, but I celebrate all month long. So, I have lots of things planned for the birthday. So I appreciate
Pre-birthday vibes. Pre-birthday
vibes. All right. So if you go to the next slide, Esme, we are going to share a little bit of background about climate resilience and walk through our framework for community-driven processes. But first, we really would like to hear from you all about what it looks like, what you think it looks like when the community leads. So what is the best of the best? What does it look like when things go really well and you get all of the things accomplished that you would like to see? We have a Mentimeter that Esme just put in the chat. If you go to the Menti and use that code, you can put in some responses and share with us what you feel really it looks like when community leads in the best kind of way. And I see some answers in the chat. We appreciate those too. I love that, heart-led and alignment. Again, it's menti.com, MENTI, and use the code 523-676-79. See some other responses. Gardens, information about what the community wants and asks, community informed, high sense of belonging, true listening and building together. Do you have, the code is not on a slide, sorry, it's just in the chat. But if folks are having problems accessing it, you can just feel free to drop it in the chat. Validation, I love that. Healthier and heartier families, which lead to more cohesive, functional communities. Equity, listening, inclusiveness, genuine connection, Great. Okay, our Menti didn't work. Womp womp, but that's okay. Community wealth, yes, I love that. And solidarity. So these are all right. These are all the things that we want communities to have. We want residents to feel, and we want leaders to understand and be respectful of, and know that if they're bringing these things into the process and are leading from a place of alignment and trying to achieve those things, then you can really get the best of what's needed for communities and by communities. So we'll go to the next slide. So power is participation in decision-making, and real participation changes the status quo. So, we often hear about engagement, community engagement, and getting feedback and gathering information and all of those things, which are wonderful, but often don't get used or don't get incorporated in the way that was intended. And it still doesn't give the decision-making power to communities, which is what really shifts the momentum and changes the status quo. And so this quote by Sherry Arnstein, we use a lot, and Corinne is going to get into later, one of the tools that was inspired by Sherry Arnstein's ladder of participation, and really understanding what it takes to get to that decision-making and true participation in the process. Next slide. All right, so what is climate resilience? We're talking about community-driven planning for the sake of climate resilience and many other things. But first, let's think about climate resilience in the context of this work. So before I get into our definition, I'd love to hear in the chat what climate resilience means to you. And I see someone is asking about the materials shared. We definitely can share the materials. We have a couple of resources linked at the end of our presentation, but I believe that ACEEE plans to send out a list of resources and the recordings from the event. So some of these answers, this is great. Safety for all, thriving in spite of climate impacts, community-driven and defined solutions. Resilience equals bouncing forward to thriving communities. Healthy, affordable access, protection against intense weather or flooding, sovereignty with respect to critical resources. Love that. Being able to maintain and thrive within our environment without being more damaging than our baseline. That's really the goal, right? We want to be able to sustain and increase and not cause further harm. Have plentiful resources to withstand climate change. That is Corinne's motto, to be a thought of abundance.
Yes, harnessing it, manifesting it, channeling it in all ways possible. Even if we don't have it, we can do that.
All right, we will go to the next slide and share a little bit about our definition. So for us, resilience equals adaptation and mitigation plus social cohesion and equity. And this is a definition that was worked on with the Climate Innovation Team, the Kresge Foundation, and Movement Generation over the last few years to really get to this set definition of resiliency for us. And so in thinking about it, resiliency is really the opposite of vulnerability. It is being able to sustain and withstand and not be vulnerable to climate impacts and the things that are happening around us. So in general, vulnerability means that there's dependency on systems and structures that are already inequitable in that they dictate how and when and where and who has access to all of the essential resources and lifelines like water, food, shelter, energy, all of the things that climate change threatens. And then vulnerability and that dependency is maintained by having those typical community engagement approaches. They're, really not trying to seek true resiliency. It's just maintaining the status quo. And so that's where the equity and social cohesion come in to being really central to climate resilience. And so when you think about this definition, it's bringing together all of the multiple bodies of work that inform community-driven efforts. So if you think about community gardens as an example, if you're looking at mitigation, it would be to help localize food systems and therefore reduce carbon emissions. When you look at adaptation, it's to become affordable, make healthy produce accessible, which is a form of adaptation, giving rising food costs. The social cohesion, it builds social cohesion, connection, networks within community members so that they connect with each other and increases their strength within their social circles and social capital. And then equity, if it is being community-led and community-owned, then the practice of holding equity at the center is really the fact that, this is a community-led process and community has the ultimate decision-making power over that particular project. So, our reality is that many communities are the most vulnerable to climate change, are those communities that have lost control or have the least control over essential resources and the least access to decision-making structures, but they also are feeling the most impacts. And so true resilience is about ultimately reducing dependency and vulnerability through community control and community governance. So in general, dependency equals vulnerability, and increasing resiliency means reducing that vulnerability. And that's what we want to strive for. And it really just aligns with those community-centered values and making sure that there is leadership and ownership and the decision-making power within those communities. Next slide. So when we think about why community-driven climate resilience planning, obviously there is a really urgent need to accelerate the pace of planning and implementation of climate solutions, but there's also a clear need to cultivate for more buy-in for climate resilience work in order to develop more effective solutions. We know that right now, more and more cities in the US are beginning to develop climate resilience plans. And a lot of times they bring in, the corporate consultants who are advising on the planning process. They aren't necessarily listening to the residents who are over living in the floodplains or who are, having air exposure and have increased asthma. They're not really taking into account what communities are saying are the problems and are the potential solutions. And so they might focus on reducing pollution or physical infrastructure. They're not taking into account the knowledge and experiences of the communities that have been made most vulnerable to climate disruption. And so they're really missing the mark on how to effectively reduce vulnerability to climate change. And we know that those who are most vulnerable are Black and Brown communities throughout this country, poor communities throughout this country. And so understanding that those are the folks who are closest to the problem and also are closest to the solutions. So what typically happens when you bring in these consultants is that they're missing the opportunity to really have holistic solutions. They aren't incorporating equity, and they really aren't looking at an equitable distribution of the infrastructure and plans that are happening. So they also aren't focused on the social cohesion and the social infrastructure aspect of it. So commitment to a particular place and shifting the decision-making processes helps to build that. So when you're really focused on a community that's experiencing the issue and then focus on shifting them to the power of the decision-making process, now you're building that social cohesion, you're infusing equity into the process, and you're really at the heart of community-driven solutions. So it's true, we need to reduce pollution and create new infrastructure, but also consider what are we focusing on pollution reduction and physical infrastructure for? Is it the communities of color that are most impacted by climate change, or is it something else? And we also need to create new social infrastructure through the planning and implementation process that really is shaped by the community. So that new social infrastructure helps to drive forward the resilience components of social cohesion and equity, but that only happens when those who are most impacted are those who are making the decisions and defining what needs to happen. We're going to get to how to reach them, David, just you wait. All right, next slide. So when we think about community-driven climate resilience planning, the goal of this is to build leadership outside of just the local government agencies, to increase collaboration and capacity, and to advance a multi-sectoral approach in order to have more holistic and effective solutions. So when the way that works is that when you're building community collaboration and ownership over the planning and implementation process, it helps to increase the capacity and increase the effectiveness of the solutions. So we know that the leadership capacity in local governments, they don't have the capacity to do all of this on their own. City officials are and staff are, overworked. They've got many demands on them. They need those outside partners in order to really facilitate a process that will be beneficial. And so instead of hiring the consultants, why not invest into your local communities? And so if residents can be part of this, then they can make sure that they get the right infrastructure, resources, and processes in place. And that helps to increase the capacity of the local governments. And so investing those resources in the training that's needed, in resourcing for folks' time and expertise, and just understanding that they are bringing something to the table, and it doesn't always have to be the outside expert, because really the internal experts are the ones that can get you where you need to go. And then the community-driven planning just helps to foster collaboration across multiple organizations, multiple sectors. That also helps to increase the capacity. And then using a multi-sectoral approach for collaboration helps to give a deeper understanding. So, when groups are siloed, you often are only thinking about the piece of the pie that's yours and what your organization focuses on and what you do really well. But when you don't take into consideration those other pieces that are all connected and impacted by each other, that just helps to increase vulnerability because you may be building up in one area, but causing harm in another area. And so helping to have those understanding through cross collaboration really brings issues to the forefront. It helps you have a wider set of experts, and creates the conditions to develop more effective solutions because you're taking a holistic approach and you're hearing from multiple fronts on how things can work. And next slide, I will hand it over to Corinne.
Thanks, Jamie. And yes, breaking out of our silos, Susan, is critical. And, it can be tough. It can be tough, for government agencies and really all of the different sectors involved to do that because we have so ingrained habits with the way that we have traditionally done planning. And we've traditionally done it in a very particular way for generations, right? Government institutions hold a responsibility when it comes to our policies, when it comes to our programs, when it really does come to meeting constituents. And at the same time, there's a reciprocal relationship there, right? That if the accountability held in the power of government institutions as an example of one institution that holds power, we know that there are many when we think about multi-sectoral, then we also need to understand that there needs to be a reciprocal relationship, not a transactional one, when we think about those in power and that have the privilege to actually make decisions to work together and ensure that policies and programs reflect the priorities of the people that have to access them, live through them, benefit from them day to day, right? And that's the current work. Like that's going to be the current work to really transition from like, how do we fundamentally shift something that is top down to be more community driven so that it can actually get to those communities that need it most, because if it can, then it really does benefit everyone. And the reason why we wanted to just take some time in the beginning to really break down some of these terms is because we never like to assume, I see friends in the chat and some of you I know, and so it's great to see y'all again. But we never want to assume when we come to a place what folks are familiar with and not familiar with. And so it's just really good practice, at least for us, to establish a baseline. What is the baseline of what we're actually talking about? And some of this has really inspired a lot of what Jamie just talked about in breaking down these terms were years and years worth of work for us to actually come together and develop this framework. And it was because we were experiencing planning that actually was happening in communities because there were big gaps in our access to planning that was happening traditionally, right? So, back in 2013, 2014, there were a lot of climate and environmental justice, community-based organizations, grassroots organizations across the country who were actively trying to either challenge and form climate plans at local levels. And there were just various ways that they were successful at doing it. There wasn't one way. So, we took those conversations over the course of the years in 2013, 2014 to really then assert, okay, you know what? Traditional top-down planning has all of these gaps. If we are going to make a fundamental shift, we have to have an alternative, right? And so ultimately that alternative that we've come up with together that is really harnessed in this framework and in its practice is the community-driven climate resilience planning framework, right? So just wanting to give shout outs. There are co-creators and co-developers of this framework that were instrumental in pulling it together so that we could actually formally have this alternative to say that like, this is the work that we need to do. It's gonna be a long arc of work coming, right? So like that abundance piece that we named now that we know it's possible to kind of do things better, right? And that is going to be a progression. And so, we're further along now than we are even when we launched in 2017. So after, again, those conversations to co-create this tool, this framework, which I would encourage you, and I know Esme is going to drop it in the chat. So for those of you that are seeing it and are like, I'm familiar, we call it CDCRP for short, but it does stand for Community-Driven Climate Resilience Planning Framework. There are many tools from the creators and co-developers of it in there. So the framework in and of itself as an approach in theory and practice is one tool, but within that, you're going to notice spotlights, you're going to notice case studies, you're going to notice links to other tools from organizations that are actively doing this work in a community-led way. So if you're like, how do we do it? What does it look like? I want to relate to some stories. I encourage you, not now, but I encourage you at a later moment to dig into it and engage with it. And of course, again, reach out to us because, you know, we can't do this justice in this very limited workshop that we have. We can just do a small snippet today here with you all. And so when we launched this framework in 2017, we were also like, you know, we've got lots of resources and tools. Sometimes we can all agree they kind of just sit there after we launch it and collect dust, maybe, especially if they're pretty long. Like we might look at it, we might have some hype on it, you know, and talk about it and have workshops, but then we might lose sight of like, how are we continuing to hold this tool and utilize it over time. And so what we asserted is that we recognize that there are many different practitioners that are doing community-driven planning. And what's really needed to complement this framework is a national network. And so that's what NACRP, it's the National Association of Climate Resilience Planners. And that also launched complementary with this framework. And we have been continuing to increase the capacity of this network that is member-driven, grassroots-driven, right, with the alignment of asserting community-led planning and community, so it's communities leading, so that we can make sure we're having place-based facilitators. We can make sure that we have referral networks and not just alternatives to these consultants that come in and can really thoughtfully help support governments and other institutions to do better policy making and planning in a more comprehensive and equitable way. And so just to kind of, you know, cover like, that's really at the heart of this framework, and it's actually at the heart of the work that we do in projects that we work on or programs that we lead in helping really increase and build our capacity toward this fundamental shift for a new way of planning. Next slide. And so as you dig into the framework, you're going to notice that central to a community-driven planning approach, one of the things that we really were able to synthesize through the development process is that they all hold one thing in common, right, which are the essential elements of planning. And so you're going to notice here some of the stuff on here on this slide is Spanish, and some of it is in English. That's intentional. And so I will take a moment to, you know, really, as I go through this slide, translate some of the Spanish pieces for those of you that don't read or speak Spanish. But I just wanted to really demonstrate the value of language justice in spaces like these. You know, we have made, you know, we tried to do our best, and part of engagement is making sure that we're creating accessible spaces. And in doing so, we have to be thinking about the language, not just the jargon, but the language in which we're able to communicate the information we want to be, you know, the messages that we want to be heard and understood. And we have to make sure that we're creating access to do that. So this is very intentional that I put Spanish here because oftentimes we still dominantly deliver information heavily in English. And we need to continue to progressively do better about holding a balance of those spaces. So again, I want to just take a moment to name that, but getting back to the essential elements and how they're all connected is that we call these the essential elements of community-driven planning because this was thematically at the heart of community plans, that many of community-driven plans start with a vision, right? They start with a community vision of really just asking like, what do we want? What do we need? Right? What do our communities basically want and need, even if we don't have it right now? And what is it going to take to get there? And if we're successful, what does it look like? So really that dreaming and liberatory space is really, really important, right? Because oftentimes if we think about traditional planning, we start with constraints first. And that could be really hard to plan because if you're starting with constraints, then you really aren't able to explore what's possible. And you're not able to plan to break down those barriers in order to then explore what's possible. So we start with, again, abundance, right, in that visioning, right? And then we think about, okay, how are we from that strong vision that is aligned, right? We want to make sure that we're in alignment. Sometimes we don't always agree, And that's going to be important, and that's going to be true in many different communities, but because we're all doing different pieces of the work. But one of the key things is we want to make sure that we're having an aligned vision, because if we're in alignment and we understand collectively what that is, then we in our various roles can make sure that we're all driving toward the same thing, and making progress in a deeper, more long-term sustainable way. And then we want to think about the other piece of the essential elements, which is really about community power, right? So here, this is where I'll translate. It's really what you're seeing there in Spanish is the ability to have influence and decision-making authority, whether it's granted or not, in traditional positions, and not in order to bring about change, right? And we want to recognize that this community power can both happen externally on an organizing level, but it can also happen within institutions. And if that is truly the balance happening, well, that's what we actually call an inside-outside strategy. So that with that vision alignment, we can ensure that the organizing that's happening in communities on the ground is actually connected and reflected into the organizing that actually needs to happen within institutions or within government, so that they can be complementary and that we can see collective wins, right? So it's not just the campaigns, it's not just, it's actually internal as well. And then from there, what we want to ensure is that there are community-led solutions that are flowing from that vision and really asserting what's possible. And so the translation there is that community solutions are important because they are representing those that are closest to the problems happening, within the environment, or things that are exacerbated by the climate crisis, right? So we have to be thinking about community-led solutions, because those that are closest to the problems are closest to the solutions, right? And so it's almost kind of like, for those of us that are familiar with permaculture, right? Nature-based systems, right? Well, there's one principle, like the problem is the solution. And so it's really acknowledging and honoring that relationship. And so again, just wanting to wrap up and close with this piece around, this is the engine and the essential elements. You'll see in the framework that these core elements of community-driven planning actually do translate to a larger web where there are about like 7 other pieces. But at the end of the day, the baseline has to be these main 3 that you want really solid and that you want to start with, and that are embedded in many of the community-driven plans that are happening locally that even end up getting adopted, right? We have some examples of community plans, and I'm sure some of you in the chat can probably think of examples where you are that actually end up informing some climate action plans or get adopted into climate action plans, right? And so at the heart of it is to really have these essential elements. Next slide. All right, so along with these essential elements, it was important for us within the framework of this just new way of, okay, community-driven planning, we have these concepts, but actually, like, what is it? How are we actually leading with values and principles? Because at the end of the day, we're working with people. Yes, we have the ecological impacts of climate, but we really need to be in relationship with all of those things in a complementary, comprehensive way. And so it was really, really important to distill these concepts into 5 principles. And those 5 principles being, whole systems thinking, desired outcomes reflected in every step, planning process is learning process. That's one of my favorite ones. Planning into action. And even most importantly, given how structures continue to exist that we're trying to do deeper work on, is balancing power dynamics among stakeholders, which is twofold. So I'm just gonna go back and I'm gonna take a moment again to break down each of these terms, because we wanna make sure that we are kind of bringing life into these and meaning into some of these concepts that we're sharing with you that some of you may be more and less familiar with. So when we think about whole systems thinking, what we really are talking about here is that we want to recognize that climate change impacts many aspects of society, right? So that's, again, as Jamie mentioned, our energy, our water, our food systems, right? Where we live, the ability to be able to afford where we live, the ability to have it be energy efficient, if we're talking about just the relevance of this summit. And so in order to do that, like, and recognize that that requires a holistic understanding of the complex challenges and also the complex and holistic solutions. So this is really kind of what Jamie was talking about when she said, like, we might oftentimes we have a habit of being siloed, and we may not do that intentionally, but when we do that, then we're just focusing on a specific piece of the pie, when really we understand that these issues and both the solutions to them have to be interconnected. So that's why we assert that a grounding principle that is essential is whole systems thinking. And then when we think about desired outcomes reflected in every step, this really does speak to the outcomes and principles such as equity, such as community-derived planning. They should be embedded in each step of the planning and implementation process, right? That we can actually have very tangible activities, very tangible things that are happening along the way that allow us to chart how we're doing and kind of gives us some information about our impact. And then that leads to, again, like I said, one of my favorite planning processes, learning process. The reason why we want to look at some of these outcomes reflected in every step is because planning processes, learning process seeks to foster multi-dimensional learning across governance levels. So what that means is that learning goes across and between stakeholders and sectors. This enables us to have the ability to actually increase understanding of causes and consequences of climate disruption and processes and pathways to address it. And so what we want to always ensure is oftentimes if we think about traditional planning processes, we might do some surveying in the beginning and then we chart along and we forward on with the plan. But because we haven't done along the way assessment and evaluation and learning, which is actually a part of engagement, a lot of times the end result, we do it after, and then we've lost a lot of time and really ultimately a lot of resources because we didn't have the opportunity to go back and make some key shifts and adjustments so that our end result could actually be much stronger and much more effective, right? And then that brings us into planning into action, right? Oh, sorry, before I go to planning into action, another just tangible example of that is timelines. We love timelines and they are a guide. They're a good marker, but we're people, right? And life happens, and we are still navigating the realities and coming out of a pandemic as the COVID variants flow, and we're still trying to adjust to the virtual world. So, sometimes timelines in and of itself can be barriers to engagement. They can be barriers to being successful because oftentimes we don't plan enough for the planning and the implementation of something. And so by the time we've done all the planning, the whole timeline is done, the funding is over, and then you have to start all over again, right? So just another example of kind of how some of these things can show up and our ability to be flexible and to make these key shifts will be better in the long run ultimately. And some of that is very much embedded in our stringent timelines that sometimes we need to be able to let go of. And then planning into action. So we want to make sure everything is in place for implementation. And what this means is resources, right? Not just financial, though financials are a big one, right? Financial resources are a big one because we have to understand that communities, it's not their day-to-day job to work in planning in the same way that government institutions and employees and staff might get salaries and benefits to do. However, that doesn't assert that planning isn't happening in other ways. And so we need to make sure that we're mitigating the impact with various resources, financial being one of them, but also capacity building resources, technical assistance, leadership readiness, etc. And then that last one, which is also really, really important as we think about how do we actually do and sustain collaboration once this engagement happens, is the principle around balancing power dynamics among stakeholder, which is twofold, because we have to be able to recognize and exist that power exists, right? So we just looked at that quote from Sherry Arnstein about participation is power, right? So power exists in our roles, power exists in our institutions, and we cannot be naive to think that it doesn't. And so we want to be transparent and recognize the realities because because the better we're able to do that, then we'll be more successful about the realities of what we're able to do and also how we're able to assert and leverage that power for what we need it for. And so one, in terms of the twofold thing, there's procedural, right? Piece of this balancing power dynamics, right, which is increasing awareness of systems of oppression and exclusionary practices, cultures that can perpetuate power imbalances, often that contribute to climate vulnerability. And then you've got the decision makers sharing power in the planning and implementation process, and groups actually increasing their capacity to step into that power, right? So that's that participation as power piece. And then we think about the other piece of it, which is substantive, our ability to increase access and also control over the essential resources that Jamie was just talking about a moment ago, but doing so at the community level, because what we want to do is reduce that vulnerability and power dynamics. We know that it exists, and in recognizing it, we have to be working toward the shift, because then participation can't be power if we're not empowering those that need it most to step into it. And that starts with being able to build that capacity and really balance that along the way. Next slide. So in that breakdown, I want to invite you all. I've done my spiel for a bit, and I want to kind of hear from y'all. Feel free to continue sharing in the chat. Keep it going. I love it. I want to hear from you in terms of what's challenging about community-led planning processes. And then also, what principles do you most connect with and why? And how do they show up in your community and in your work? Oh, I'm receiving the love. Thank you. So are y'all. And this is why I'm putting it to y'all, because we are over 300, almost 400 into this virtual community of resource and experts. Yes, there are resources and guides for sure. All right, Ashley, I found in my participation in planning processes that facilitators will take a long time to be inclusive of goals and objectives of many in community, but they spend very little time on implementation because they are afraid of the contentious nature of prioritizing actions. They need to be more comfortable with setting priorities together, even if it's a tough conversation. Absolutely, absolutely. Because then, I mean, and I think, again, part of that is just the recognition of being able to navigate tensions and conflict. That's going to happen. Yeah. Part of the challenge is that community leaders are often not paid for our work, so we find it challenging to participate fully in the process. Yes, that's the access piece that we need to think about for sure. And we're going to get into that when we look at the tool. All right. And we've got a reply here. Oh, here we go. Yeah, one key challenge is the community contributions are used to create impressive systems that get grants for everyone except the soldiers. Thank you. Yes, tedious meetings. We got to make these processes fun and engaging, right? I mean, if we think about, okay, let's just take kind of a page from a book of like corporate mergers, all these fancy dinners, going to a bar, breaking bread like on a company card. Can we think about actually how do we relationally come together, have conversations and build? It's oftentimes not in like these closed door meetings on the clock from a 9 to 5 where other people kind of have jobs that they need for their like livelihood, but they're still committed to a quality of life. So how are we actually creating senses of community and actually going to where the leaders are cultivating this all the time, right? Instead of actually saying, hey, come do our thing. We're having this engagement event. Come speak at the city council meeting. Come help us with how are we just thinking about other ways in which we can be meeting community where they're at instead of asking them to meet us where we're at, especially if we're low on resources to invite them in. Yeah. All right. Yes.
There was a question on are there good community-driven planning consultants?
Yes. And it's the national, so this is why we are continuing to build out the National Association of Climate Resilience Planners. And yes, we are actually at the end of the month having a certification for our cohort of community-driven facilitators. But we have lots of partners and members that are a part and in our network that help us do this work in different ways across the country. Yeah. All right, so these are great. Keep them coming. And again, for the interest of time, I have to move on to the next slide. Some of what, like Jamie said, it's coming, it's coming. Okay, how do we actually do this engagement? Okay, we're acknowledging what exists, we're getting there. So again, similarly to the framework, some of y'all might have heard of the community engagement to ownership spectrum tool. And so it is a complementary tool that actually came out of the co-development of the community-driven climate resilience planning framework, where we were asserting a new way of planning. And critical to a new way of planning is that we have to be able to actually do better engagement as a part of these fundamental shifts. And so you'll also, some of you may be more familiar with, you might have heard it. This was launched shortly after and worked on in 2017 when we launched the framework and when we launched the NACRP, the National Association of Climate Resilience Planners. The creator of the tool is Rosa Gonzalez from Facilitating Power, also a partner member of our National Association of Climate Resilience Planners. And at the time when this was created, we were a program held within the Movement Strategy Center. And so now we are incubated and grown into our own organization. And so it was really essential for us to take some, influence from some similar tools, like Sherry Arnstein, who said participation in power, this tool specifically is inspired by the Arnstein ladder of participation. Okay, so you're gonna see that. But what is distinct about this tool is that it takes, two very distinct things to know about this tool. And Esme is gonna drop the whole tool in the chat just so that you have that link, and of course links will be shared. And again, don't dig into it now because it's a more extensive tool. But one thing to note is that this tool is both an assessment tool, which I think most people know it for, but it's also a developmental design tool. So that's just always something that I like to kind of make clear about this tool is that, one, yes, it's important to assess where we are, but we have to be able to understand how we then assess where we are to then create a plan and design a plan with community that entails a developmental process to improve our engagement and really work through and toward community ownership of systems. Because that's ultimately, if we know we've been successful and communities can thrive without being vulnerable, right, by dependency on systems, then we've been successful. So one thing to note is that this tool really does chart a pathway, and it is a developmental process. So it goes all the way from inform, and actually you're going to see in a moment, it actually goes a step before that, 0, which is ignore, all the way to defer to, right? And so inform being the ability to provide the community with relevant information. This might look like, just all the different ways we can think about how just we might see or not information that goes out. So think about an Amber Alert, right? Like those things are like critical pieces of information that we need to know. And then there's the consult phase, which is like gathering input from the community. So this might look like how many of us kind of get these random text messages that ask us what we think, and if we can rate how this program is doing or give input, or maybe it's a campaign type text and we're collecting this information and we might respond to it or not. And then there's involve, right, where we're wanting to ensure community needs and assets after we've actually collected the information are actually integrated into the planning to inform actually what gets solidified or then moved on to the next level of implementation. And this is the important phase, right? Because different from consults, what we're saying is that when we get consulted, information is collected, but we really have no way of knowing what's happening with that information. But when we involve, we have the ability to then think about how the value of contributions of what we've asked folks for then gets implemented. And then we move to collaborate for, which is like, we want to then, after we've done that, after we've had that involvement, ensure community capacity to play a leadership role in implementing decisions, right? So it's not just like, oh, okay, I understand how my contributions have influenced the plan, but what is my role in that? If I'm doing that work, like, how do I get recognized to play a leadership role? How do I even get the recognition and resources to benefit extensions of being able to like service my community? And then defer to, right? Ultimately, if we are developmentally creating and increasing our capacity of engagement, which should be reciprocal, ongoing, sustainable, that we're also wanting to increase the way in which different resources and expertise and collaboration are allocated. And so what this says is that if we're successful, we want to be able to foster democratic participation and equity by bridging the divide between community and governance through community-driven decision-making. And so one example of this that folks might be familiar with is like participatory budgeting. And is participatory budgeting like perfect? No. Like, I used to live in Vallejo, very small percentage of the budget, but it really is just charting a pathway toward taking something that is oftentimes held within institutional government power and then creating a way in which we can be fostering some sort of infrastructure for communities to have that power to govern for themselves. Next slide. So commitment to language, yes, Vallejo, shout out to Vallejo. I know I had to move from there, sadly, but I love living in Vallejo. So I just wanted to share that the previous slide that I just went over for my Spanish readers and my Spanish speakers, that this is the Spanish version of the slide. And so just wanting to name that here. And in a moment, when we get into an activity that I'll invite you all to do, that will be shared with you so that you will have direct access and reference to that. But everything on this slide is just the Spanish version of what I've just gone over. Next slide. And so remember how I said that, like, we were just talking about one, inform all the way to defer to, but that a step beyond that is zero, ignore. So again, you know, what we want to understand here about this tool and why we need to think about how we're doing engagement is because these are reflections of the real ways in which communities experience how engagement happens when it's held in institutional power. And all the way to the extreme left is marginalization, where there is really no access at all, right? There's no decision-making power, there's no participation power, there's no even, it's kind of what Susan said, that like, either some folks don't want to be a part of it or they do, and maybe they don't know because they didn't know that meetings happened. They didn't know they could play a role, right? So we really do want to recognize that on the far end of the spectrum, it still does exist. And this is because of power, that folks just don't have, communities just don't have access to be able to try and participate. But that in charting a pathway as we go to inform, which is, again, we've shifted that a bit to be both preparation or placation, consult, which is like that limited voice and tokenization, voice, which is like, oh, okay, we see how our voice is being embedded in plans. Delegated power, we're starting to practice what it ultimately then looks like to then start actually building structures of community ownership. And the reason why I say that this is a developmental process is because that each stage of the spectrum, they all hold keys to this process, or to move up the spectrum, or to progress along it. But another important point to make is that they also hold blocks and barriers to get stuck. And the reason is because just as this is a tool to both assess and design, if we are not accurately assessing where we are, meaning that even if we may want to be involved, if we're not really there and we're not doing an accurate assessment of the activities that we're doing to engage folks, it might be that, oh, we invited them to the meeting, we made it in multiple languages, but they just didn't care because they didn't show up. Well, did we do an accurate assessment of like maybe why they didn't show up? What time was it at? Did they get the, how do we know? Did we get the information? And that's kind of an example of kind of being a trap or getting stuck in the developmental process, is not having an accurate assessment of the impact and the success of the activities along each stage. And also why planning processes, learning process, the principle is important, because we need to then be able to make key shifts in order to do that. And at the bottom, you're going to notice that resource allocation and ratios are a part of the key shifts. So you'll notice as we progress along the developmental process of the spectrum, that systems administration investment, meaning that like money and time and capacity and roles and power and decision making is heavily held 100%. And you'll notice that as we progress along the spectrum to defer to, that number is shifting quite significantly, right? So that we don't have heavily systems admin investment of resources. We actually are moving those resources, both financial and also both in terms of roles and decision making, to community. So one example of that is like, okay, well, maybe we don't need a consultant. Maybe we actually need to get the experts that are rooted in community to be our community partner, because they probably have already done assessments of what the priorities are. And so why don't we actually move resources to them instead of hiring a consultant who isn't from a place, who may have a fancy, like, high expensive rate and look all nice and glossy, but that can actually go into a community and cause a lot of harm because they're not recognizing and honoring the work that's already happening there, right? And so these are just examples of like how we can both have a pathway of like holding a key to progress along the developmental spectrum, but also how we can get caught in the traps, because it's really easy, right? It's easy to work with who we know, it's comfortable. We were kind of worried about upsetting someone. We don't want to do this thing. And I hate this term of like engagement fatigue, or we're like, they're tired of hearing from us. They don't have capacity. We don't have money for them. But really to get out of those assumptions and actually think about, one, there's many communities working, not just a handful of usual suspects. So like our ability to get out of the comfort zone and really build these relationships so that we're broadening and widening our ecosystem of community partners that we can be working with so that we can continue that developmental process. So just wanted to take a moment to just really do kind of an overview of the tool, its purpose, and kind of some of the key things to know about applying the tool. So now I want to invite you all to engage with the tool a bit, right? I'm sure that as you all are looking at this tool and you're like, oh, we do some of that. Oh, yep, I'm over here. This is where I am on the spectrum. Here's some of the goals. I want to offer, we're going to take about, oh, we're doing good on time. So we're going to take about 10 minutes, may even stretch that to 15. I'll do a check-in in a moment. We've got some handouts that Esme is going to go ahead and put in the chat. Thank you, Esme. These are a set of guiding questions. And Esme, if you want to screen share, I can talk through the activity. And in the handouts, we're going to screen share back once we give you some time to work on these so that we can then hear from you some of your reflections. And while Esme is working to share screen, once I go over this handout with you, you will have about 10 minutes to work on it. And for ease and reference, you'll see that there is a link to the particular slide, the actual tool slide that I was just showing you and talking through, just in case as you're going through these prompts, you want a quick reference. So I want to go through that a bit just to make sure you all are clear before you all have time to work on it on your own. Normally, we like to break out, but we just can't break out realistically over almost 400 of you. Or in person, we'll do this work together. So we're just going to have some individual time. Then we're going to have, I'm going to ask a few folks if they can actually share each of the pieces. So what we want to do here is we want to just take a moment based on the spectrum tool that I showed you to map, reflect, assess, and set goals. At the bottom of this document for my Spanish speakers and readers, it is in a Spanish version as well. So just scroll down and you're going to see your version. Linked in there as well will be the reference slide that you can reference for the tool that I just went over in Spanish. Just scroll back up a little bit. What you want to do here at the first part in the mapping exercise is you want to name at least one activity and or example along each stage using the prompts below, right? So, and each of the prompts they translate to each stage of the spectrum tool, right? So 0 all the way to 5. And these are just some guiding questions to really think about your own work, your own place. And you'll even notice that 4 and 5 are really, really specific to even why you wanted to come to this summit, right? So even take a moment to think deeply about, well, what do these things mean in terms of holistic retrofits and affordable housing, right? That are going to improve energy savings and health benefits and local jobs, et cetera, right? So we're gonna take some time first to go through and do at least one example or activity for each stage there. And then you're gonna take some time to reflect. And scroll down, scroll up a bit, Esme. And you want to think about, okay, after I've done that, what are you seeing? What are the strengths you're seeing there? And also, what are the gaps you're seeing about some of those examples and activities that you've identified for each of the stages along the spectrum? And then after that, take a moment and think about, okay, now that you've done this, where would you assess that your work is or what you've mapped is along the spectrum? Like, where does it currently fall? And then finally, set a goal, right? You want to kind of set a goal where you are along the spectrum about where you actually want your work to be. And maybe even think about when that might be possible. You all will have about 10 minutes-ish or so. Esme is going to play some music while you all are working on this. There are various ways depending on where you are. If you're on your phone, maybe you want to use notes. This is not an editable document. It is a reference document. So if you need to pull up another Google Doc or you need to pull up a Word doc just to kind of record your reflections, because we are going to come back and share. And I'm going to ask for 4 volunteers. And if they can put their stack into the chat when we come back, just to kind of come off mute and like share each phase of where they landed so that we can kind of wrap up.